The Shadow of Man, Chapter 2. I retained the strange feeling that I was living in a dream world throughout the 12-mile journey from Kigoma to our camping place in the Gombe Stream Reserve. It was the middle of the dry season, and the shoreline of the Congo, though it was only 25 miles distant, was not even faintly discernible to the west of long, narrow Lake Tanganyika. The fresh breeze and the deep blue of the water, which was choppy with little waves and flecked with white foam, combined to make us feel that we were at sea. I gazed at the eastern shoreline. Between Kigoma and the start of the Chimpanzee sanctuary, the steep slopes of the rift escarpment, which rise 2,500 feet above the lake, are in many places bare and eroded from years of tree felling. In between, small pockets of forest cling to the narrow valleys, where fast-flowing mountain streams rush down to the lake. The coastline is broken into a series of elongated bays, often separated by rocky headlands that jut out into the lake. We steered a straight course, proceeding from headland to headland, but we noticed that the little canoes of the fishermen hugged the shoreline. David Anstey, who was traveling with us to introduce us to the local African inhabitants of the area, explained that sometimes the lake becomes suddenly rough, with fierce winds sweeping down the valleys and churning the water into a welter of spray and waves. All along the shoreline, tiny fishing villages clung to the mountain slopes or nestled in the mouths of the valleys. The dwellings were mostly simple mud and grass huts, although even in those days there were a few larger buildings roofed with shiny corrugated iron. That curse, for those who love natural beauty, of the modern African landscape. But of course, a lot better for the people, they don't get rained on. When we had travelled about 7 miles, David pointed out the large rocky outcrop that marks the southern limits of the Chimpanzee Reserve. Once past the boundary, we noticed the country had changed suddenly and dramatically. The mountains were thickly wooded and interspersed by valleys supporting dense tropical forests. Even here we noticed a number of fishermen's huts dotted at intervals along the white beaches. David explained that these were temporary structures. The Africans had permits to fish during the dry season and to dry their catch in the sun on the beaches of the reserve itself. But when the rains began, the fishermen returned to their home villages outside the Chimpanzee Reserve. It was amongst these men that the recent troubles had broken out, some argument between the fishermen of 2 different villages as to which of them had the right to a certain stretch of beach. Since that day, I have often wondered exactly what it was that I felt as I stared at the wild country that so soon I should be roaming. Van admitted afterwards that she was secretly horrified by the steepness of the slopes and the impenetrable appearance of the valley forests, and David Anstey told me several months later that he had guessed I would be packed up and gone within 6 weeks. I remember feeling neither excitement nor trepidation, but only a curious sense of detachment. What had I, the girl standing on the government launch in her jeans, to do with the girl who in a few days would be searching those very mountains for wild chimpanzees? Yet by the time I went to sleep that night, the transformation had taken place. After a 2-hour journey, the launch dropped anchor at Kasakela, where the 2 government game scouts had their headquarters. David Anstey had suggested that, at least until we were familiar with the area, we should camp somewhere near their huts. As our dinghy approached the white sandy beach, we saw that quite a crowd had gathered to watch our arrival. The 2 scouts, the few Africans who had permission to live permanently at the reserve, so that the scouts should not be completely isolated, and some of the fishermen from nearby huts. We stepped ashore, splashing into the sparkling wavelets, and were greeted first by the scouts, and then, with great ceremony, by the honorary headman of Kasakela village, old Idi Matata. He was a colourful figure with his red turban, red European-style coat over flowing white robes, wooden shoes, and white beard. He made a long speech of welcome to us in Swahili, of which I understood only fragments, and we presented him with a small gift, which David had advised us to buy for him. The formalities over, Van and I followed David for about 30 yards along a narrow track leading from the beach through thick vegetation to a small natural clearing. With the help of David and the African scouts, the large tent which Van and I would share was soon up. Behind the tent flowed a small gurgling stream, and the clearing was shaded by tall oil nut palms. It was a perfect campsite. 50 yards or so distant, under some trees on the beach, we set up another small tent for Dominic, the cook we had employed before leaving Kigoma. When our camp was organized, I slipped away to explore. The tall grass of the lower mountain slopes had been burnt off by a recent bushfire, and the charcoal-encrusted ground was slippery. It was about 4 o'clock, but still the sun burned down fiercely, and I was hot and sweating by the time I climbed high enough to look down over the flat lake and the broad valley, lush and green by contrast with the blackened mountainside on which I stood. I sat on a big flat rock, hot from the sun, and slowly I could feel myself coming alive after the depression of that week in Kigoma and the trance-like state in which I had been since leaving that morning. Presently, a troop of about 60 baboons passed by, searching the newly burnt ground for the remains of baked insects. Some of them climbed trees when they saw me and shook the branches with jerky, threatening movements, and 2 of the big males started their loud alarm bark. But on the whole, the troop was not very worried by my presence, and soon moved slowly on, busy with its own affairs. I saw a bushbuck too, a graceful chestnut animal, slightly larger than a goat, with sturdy, spiraling horns. He stared at me motionless, and then suddenly turned and bounded away, barking like a dog and flashing the white underside of his tail. I only stayed out on the mountain about 3/4 of an hour, but when I returned, almost as black as the slopes on which I'd been scrambling, I no longer felt like an intruder. That night, I pulled my camp bed into the open and slept with the stars above me, twinkling down through the rustling fronds of a palm tree. The next morning, of course, I was eager to go out looking for chimpanzees, but I soon found that to start with anyway, I was not to be my own master. David Anstey had arranged for a number of the local Africans to come and meet Van and me. He explained that they were all worried and resentful. They couldn't believe that a young girl would come all the way from England just to look at apes, and so the rumor had spread that I was a government spy. I was, of course, very grateful to David for sorting things out for me right at the start, but my heart sank lower and lower when I heard the plans he had made for me. Firstly, it was agreed that the son of the chief of Mwamgongo, a large fishing village to the north of the chimpanzee reserve, should accompany me. He would make sure that when I saw one chimpanzee, I didn't write down in my book that I'd seen 10 or 20. I realized later that the Africans were still hoping to reclaim the 30 square miles of the reserve for themselves. If I stated there were more chimpanzees than in fact there were, then the Africans felt government could make a better case for keeping the area a protected reserve. Secondly, David felt that for the sake of my prestige, I should employ an African to carry my haversack. Since I was convinced that the only way to establish contact with shy animals was to move about alone, I was upset to think I must be encumbered by 2 companions. Then came the final blow. I also had to have one of the game scouts with me. I felt depressed and miserable when I went to bed that night. When I woke up the next morning, however, everything was new and exciting, and my gloom soon vanished. I'd arranged to meet the chief's son at a valley near the northern boundary, for my game scout, Adolf, had reported seeing chimpanzees whilst patrolling there the day before. David Anstey had some business in Wamgongo village, so he took me, together with Adolf and Rashidi, my porter, in his boat and dropped us off at the appointed place. The chief's son came towards us, followed by 5 or 6 other Africans, and I had a sudden horror that they would all insist on coming with me. But my fears were quickly allayed. The young man asked where I planned to go, and I pointed vaguely towards the steep, thickly forested slopes of the valley. He looked rather taken aback and began to talk quietly and earnestly with his friends in Kiha, the language of the local Ha tribesmen. A few moments later, he again approached and told me that he felt rather unwell and would not go with me that day. Later, I found out that he expected I would merely ride up and down the lakeshore in a boat, counting any chimpanzees I saw. The idea of clambering about in the mountains did not appeal to him at all, and I never saw him again. Just as we were leaving, 2 fishermen ran up and asked us to follow them for a moment. They led us to a tree just behind one of the temporary huts. The bark was gashed in 100 places. There, we learned, a lone bull buffalo had chased one of the fishermen the night before. The man had managed to climb to safety, but the buffalo had charged at the slender tree time and time again. Whether the men were merely making a report to the game scout, or whether they were trying to impress me with the hazards of their country, I don't know. But the memory of that battered tree haunted me for weeks when I was crawling about in the thick forests of the valley. After this, we set off up the Mitumba Valley, and I soon found myself walking through the sort of African forest of which I had always dreamed. There were giant buttressed trees festooned with lianas, and here and there brilliant red or white flowers that gleamed through the dark foliage. We moved along beside a fast-flowing, shallow stream, often wading across when the going was easier on the opposite side. Now and then a kingfisher or some other forest bird flashed past, and once a troop of red-tailed monkeys leapt across a gap overhead, their coppery tails glinting. The forest canopy, over 100 feet above us, shut out most of the sunlight, and there was little undergrowth along the valley bottom. When we'd been travelling for about 20 minutes, Adolf left the stream and led us up the side of the valley. Almost at once, the going became much more difficult. The trees were smaller, and the undergrowth was thick and tangled with vines, so that we had to crawl most of the time. Presently Adolf stopped under an enormous tree. I looked up and saw it was laden with small orange and red fruits. Down below, the ground was littered with broken-off twigs and partly eaten fruits. This was the msulula tree that the chimpanzees had been feeding the day before. I hadn't intended to go right up to the tree, and hoping that we had not disturbed any chimpanzees, I quickly told my guides I wanted to watch from further away, from the other side of the valley. 10 minutes later, we were settled in a little grassy clearing at about the same height as the msulula tree and directly opposite. I discovered afterwards that it was in fact the only really good open space from which one could watch the tree. Rashidi's trained eye had spotted it instantly, whereas I at the time would never have noticed it. It seemed very quiet and peaceful away from the rushing of the stream. Some cicadas were shrilling incessantly, and there were some bird songs and the occasional bark or scream of a baboon. All at once I was tense with excitement, for in the valley below I heard the calling of a group of chimpanzees. I'd heard the chimpanzees in the zoo, of course, but out here in the African forest, the sound was thrilling beyond words. First one chimp gave a series of low, resonant pantoots, loud hooting calls connected by audible, inhalations of breath, sort of. That's sort of how it sounds. These calls grew louder and louder until in the end the chimpanzee was almost screaming. Halfway through his calling, another one joined in, and then another. I'd read of chimpanzees drumming on tree trunks when I went through the report of Dr. Nissen. Now I heard the strange echoing sound for myself, reverberating through the valley, interspersed with that wild chorus of panthers. The group was very close to the musulula tree, and I waited with every sense alert, staring into the forest opposite. Even so, it was Rashidi who saw the first movement as the chimpanzee climbed up a palm trunk and so into the branches of the giant tree. It was followed by another and another and another, each climbing in orderly procession. I counted 16 in all, some large, some much smaller. One was a mother with a tiny infant clinging to her tummy. Excited as I was, I couldn't help feeling disappointed. Although the chimpanzees remained for 2 hours in the tree, I saw little except an occasional glimpse of a black arm reaching out from the foliage and pulling branches of fruit out of sight. And then, one after the other, and in complete silence, the whole group climbed down the palm tree ladder and vanished into the forest. That was what amazed me most. 16 chimpanzees in one tree, and yet the only sounds I had heard them make had been the calls announcing their arrival. A few minutes after the last chimpanzee had gone, when I was still searching the valley with my binoculars in the hope of seeing the group climbing into another tree, I was horrified to hear Adolf and Rashidi announce that we must return as it was their time for eating. I remonstrated in vain until I felt myself on firmer ground. I dared not order them to stay, nor did I dare risk David Anstey's displeasure by remaining without my escorts. As we filed back through the forest, however, I determined that things would be different in future. The musulula continued to bear fruit for another 10 days, and Rashidi and Adolf took turns to accompany me, taking their midday meals with them. For 3 nights, in fact, we slept there, Rashidi and Adolf huddled close together in the glow of a small campfire, and myself further back, wrapped up in a blanket. I saw many chimpanzees during those 10 days. Sometimes large groups climbed up and fed on the musulula fruits, and sometimes there were only 2 or 3 individuals in a group. Twice I saw a completely solitary male who fed over an hour by himself. I soon realized that the groups were not stable. Once, for instance, 14 chimps arrived together, but they left in 2 different groups, the second climbing down a full half hour after the first. And judging from the subsequent sounds, they went off in different directions. On another occasion, I saw 2 small groups meet up in the tree, with much screaming and rushing about through the branches. Then they quietened, fed peacefully together, and, so far as I could tell, moved off together. I found out, too, that some groups comprised only adult males, some only females and youngsters, and others consisted of males, females, and youngsters all together. I was, however, far from satisfied. I saw very few interactions between individual chimpanzees. The foliage of the musulula was far too thick, and when I twice tried to watch from nearby, I failed dismally. Once the chimps saw me on their way to the tree and fled, and on the second occasion, all I saw of the 4 who fed for an hour almost above me was a very brief glimpse as they climbed up and subsequently down the palm ladder. Later, however, I realized how lucky I'd been during the fruiting of the musulula tree. I probably learned more during those 10 days than I did during the 8 depressing weeks that followed. Search as we would, we found no other large fruiting tree or group of fruiting trees. We went up most of the 12 valleys of the reserve, but the undergrowth was often very thick. and whilst the sound of the streams certainly drowned any noise we made, it also effectively camouflaged the sounds which might have warned us of the whereabouts of chimps. Those which we did see were usually so close by the time we came upon them that they fled instantly. I can well imagine now how many times they must have seen us coming and silently vanished without our ever being aware of their presence. We had slightly better luck when we climbed the ridges between the valleys, but again the chimps either hurried away at sight of us, even when we were 500 yards distant on the other side of a ravine, or else were so far off that it was impossible to see any details of their behavior. For a while I wondered whether it was because there were 3 of us that the chimpanzees seemed so frightened. But even when I left my 2 companions on some high peak from where they could keep an eye on me and tried to get closer to some distant group on my own, the reaction of the chimpanzees was the same. They fled. In between the disappointing days when we only saw chimps too far off to observe properly, or for a few minutes close by before they fled, were even worse days when we saw no chimps at all. The more I thought of the task I had set myself, the more despondent I became. Nevertheless, those weeks did serve to acquaint me with the rugged terrain. My skin became hardened to the rough grass of the valleys, and my blood immune to the poison of the tsetse fly, so that I no longer swelled hugely each time I was bitten. I became increasingly sure-footed on the treacherous slopes that were equally slippery whether they were bare and eroded, crusted with charcoal, or carpeted by dry, trampled grass. Gradually, too, I became familiar with many of the animal tracks in the 5 valleys that became my main work area. I encountered many of the other denizens of the mountains during our daily wanderings, huge grey bush pigs with their silvery spinal crests, troops of banded mongooses rustling through the leaves in search of insects, the squirrels and the striped and spotted elephant shrews of the thick forests. Gradually, too, I sorted out the many different kind of monkeys that can be found in the Gombe stream area. Most often, we came across troops of baboons. Sometimes they accepted our presence quite calmly, like those I met that first afternoon, but others would bark persistently and noisily until we or they had moved out of sight. In each of the valleys, there were 2 or 3 small troops of red-tailed monkeys and a few blue monkeys. There were much larger groups of red colobus monkeys, numbering 60 or more, each of which ranged over a couple of valleys. Occasionally we came across a solitary silver monkey with its black face framed by a white band of hair. There were even a few troops of vervet monkeys down by the lakeshore to remind me of my monkey-watching days on Lolloway Island. In particular, I like to watch the red colobus. They are large monkeys, and occasionally I fleetingly mistook the adult males for chimpanzees because in some lights the dark brown hair of their backs looks black, and they sit upright on the branches, holding an overhead bough with one hand, more like apes than monkeys. But their long, thick, hanging tails soon revealed their true identity. When I got close to them and they peered down at me from the branches, their faces always reminded me of surprised maiden aunts, wearing ginger-red wigs. Rashidi taught me a great deal about bush law and how to find my way through seemingly impenetrable forest. And despite my initial disappointment when I heard that I was not allowed to be alone, I was grateful for his help during those early days. But he soon had to leave me to return for a while to his village, and as I found that Adolf the Scout was not suited to long, arduous hours without food in the mountains, I had a succession of other African companions during the next few months. There was Soko from Nyanza, whose name caused much amusement among local Africans, for this is their name for the chimpanzee. Next came the enormously tall and willowy Wilbut, who always looked immaculate, even after scrambling on his belly along a pig trail. And finally Short, who, as his name implies, was very small. All three were tough men who had spent their lives working in the bush with animals, and I enjoyed their company and learned much during the days they worked for me.